Thank you very much for the invite to be here. The first, when you tell colleagues you're going up to Bradford, the look in the European and global team is, well, who's there? Who's that leading light, that global expert that's going to put input into my clinical trials and give me output? And then they look at even our clinical trial program. You'll hear from Rod from AZ later, and actually look who's able to deliver. And actually the infrastructure and the track record of a small city in the north is not, as we heard earlier, just competing with Manchester, Leeds, Huddersfield, York. It's competing with the Oxford, Cambridge, Londons. And from my own experience as an investigator and a clinician, I was so focused on those places that I studied that we weren't often looking far enough afield. The NIHR has come a long way in being able to help companies to identify places that can deliver on trials. But also the evidence that Dinesh just gave in that graph of income increasing, but also the fact that you're second to the Brompton is a real accolade for what is a fifth biggest city. I didn't know that, but a large city in the UK that is a little bit off the beaten track, but with an infrastructure like this, a beautiful research facility, and patients, most importantly, that you're able to put into trials, becoming a very attractive place to go. So I was going to give you a talk on what, as a company, we and other pharmaceutical companies are looking for in trials. There was another thing we heard about earlier about Bradford, is about the size of an organization. And if you are a small, nimble organization that's got R&D sat in an office that's next door, so you can knock on them and say, can you push this contract through, you will inevitably do much better than some of the big teaching hospital beasts, where they have everyone coming to them with contracts all at the same time, and they actually really struggle to get contracts through in a timely fashion. So I'll concentrate a bit on the UK and what we do well and what we could really do a bit better at. So some of this is, I'm going to start off with what I learned as an investigator from the investigator side of trials and how things have, my outlook on things now that I'm on the industry side. So this was my experience. So while I was an academic orthopod in training, doing my PhD and a clinical lecture, I was in the lab. I was writing grant proposals, I was getting clinical training finished, writing papers, doing posters, going to congresses, and then somewhere in there was the clinical trials. And the industry trials that I ran, they came to us and said, can you deliver on this trial? We'd say yes. The boss would get a pot of money that would fund a little bit of my research, be it consumables or a bit of salary. But really, in terms of what I was giving, that was probably one of the lowest things that I had as a priority. There was lots of other stuff that I was trying to do, and I was really trying to juggle all of those things. And so there's a few things that made me a bad investigator. I did do in clinical trials so that I could innovate, bring new treatment options to patients. It was an interest to me, and I was really looking at an academic career and looking at bringing research funding in. So I said research team, which really back then was me and one research nurse, but she just did a bit of work across an entire portfolio of trials. And so I was the co-investigator on a couple of trials, and I did things that were not ideal from a company's point of view. So late data entry in ECRF, understanding of A reporting. So I had a lady that needed an elective hysterectomy. She went in for elective hysterectomy. She came out, she was absolutely fine, and I didn't report it as an AE. Having not concentrated on the protocol enough, it was an elective hospital admission which needed reporting, even though it was completely planned. The PI was not very good at signing things off on time, and I think that what you have to understand is that when the PI is signing off a protocol, if they're leading as the country lead investigator, the ethics forms, those are legally binding documents with a regulatory authority that actually carry a lot of weight. I think gone are the days where we used to go to the Oxford, Cambridge, Londons of the world so that we could get their name on the paper. My boss used to regularly say, oh, they can wait for us whilst we finished off a theatre list because actually they want Oxford more than we need them. And it's very much has to be a partnership moving forwards, and one that I think if you go to sites where you can get easy access to PIs, then you actually feel like you're building something. So the current challenges in some of the fields that we work in, I saw rheumatology, respiratory up there, is that there's a lot of drugs in development, and things are changing in so much as in somewhere like the UK where there's an existing standard of care, you are less likely to put people into a placebo-controlled trial. There's got to be a good reason for it. A lot of them may have failed previous treatments, but then that's also skewing the enrollment population, plus they have to wash out if they are on something. But it is more difficult, and so it becomes more attractive for big pharma companies to go to the likes of Eastern Europe, South America, where they may get much quicker and better recruitment. Part of the issue in that is that you see higher placebo rates. Patients are much happier when they're being seen every 2 to 4 weeks than if they're being seen as their regular standard of care within those countries. And the other issue that we had as Sanofi Genzyme is our company footprint. And you have some big powerhouses of respiratory research, and we are new to the field of respiratory. But it all balances out in so much as multiple sclerosis, rare diseases. We have a big foothold in the UK. Something like alemtuzumab, Lemtrada, was developed in Cambridge. And so when it came to clinical trials, we did extremely well on delivering on those, and less so in the respiratory field. So I'll just take you briefly through some of the process that we go through in order to go through site selection. We have a pre-assessment, and then we have operational feasibility. Now, pre-assessment tends to be going to a couple of global experts. So those people that have their name on every paper, have 300 plus publications that are recognized worldwide. And what they do is they look at a pre-protocol, so an extended synopsis, and they send it to the countries for assessment of feedback. In other words, will this fit in your country based on current practice? So things like they need 3 CT scans a year for something like nasal polyposis didn't fly. That trial didn't come to the UK. Bradford did deliver on another trial which was shorter and needed a single CT scan, so we had 2 CT scans. In terms of the study design, the patient burden, are there enough patients with that disease that we could enroll well? And that's fed back to global, and then you take it to the next stage of protocol development. You then move to the operational feasibility stage, and depending on how each country is organized, for us, this is a North Sea cluster. So the organization has a cluster which includes North America, South America, and for Northern Europe, the North Sea cluster includes the UK. That's to basically select countries. So we do use the NIHR feasibility process. We will go to them and they will say, these are the sites that we think can deliver on your trial. With an assessment of numbers, and then we get that back. But don't put yourselves in my shoes. So I'm UK born and bred. I'm very proud of the respiratory research that's done in the UK, but it's not my boss or my boss's boss. It's my boss's boss's boss that has a $10 to $50 million trial that he has to deliver on time within a certain budget that's going to look at that. And sometimes we don't even find out that things haven't come to the UK until they've started. So it's part of that big cumbersome beast that we were talking about. We have medical affairs, clinical development, and clinical study operations. And the operations teams are really the number crunchers that will look at the things like budget, time to delivery of a trial. They'll want to look at things like a funnel analysis. So if this is the population of Bradford, and this is the population with asthma and severe asthma that are not already involved in a trial that could maybe be involved in a trial, then we want to see how that develops and the likelihood of delivery. But I think what I saw last week at the national meeting, and also from Dinesh today, is actually looking at the delivery and reaching that 80% of target is something that we look at very favorably. So the things that we need for investigators and sites, so fast setup, including signing of contracts, cost negotiation, good recruitment targets, good quality data, so we get that generally by having worked with people before and knowing that they can actually deliver that. Easy and rapid communication, so being able to get in touch with the PI to resolve queries. And the biggest issue that we see nationally is having sufficient staff resource and a stable team at site. If you have people that are constantly coming and going, so for example, units that work on a research registrar that rotates every 3 to 6 months is, as the only researcher, is much less stable than one that's got 2 or 3 nurses, a PI that's always there, and of course the registrar can come in and do some of that work as a co-investigator in between, but it's not a team that's in constant flux. So we will look at these patient pathways and pre-screening logs. So if you can identify patients from electronic patient records that you think might be suitable for a trial, then that's something that we'll look at very favorably. But we will reject sites, even if they've got an excellent scientific team, but they've got a poor operational team. We routinely use the NHR costing templates, and I think that's been relatively easy in Bradford, but still be known there are sites nationally that take that as guidance and not as gospel, and so we're constantly having to go back and forth with costing templates, and we do use the ABPI model clinical trial agreement. So the common issues really are inconsistent costings, and I'll give you a couple of examples. If you go to a site with 2 different trials, one in asthma, for example, and one in musculoskeletal disease. You can go to the team one day, and an ECG or an X-ray will cost you £300 on one day and £500 the next day. But it's the same hospital that's delivering on the research. And so that really, for us, makes it very difficult to contract and enter into negotiations when that shouldn't be the case. So having that consistency is important. The costs are reviewed by multiple support departments. So I think gone are the days of the simple diabetes trial done in primary care where you look at an HbA1c every 3 to 6 months and you deliver your trial at 12 months to say, look at how the HbA1c dropped. We're now looking at needing multiple support functions, be it everything from phlebotomy and ECG all the way to complex imaging or bronchoscopy. and theatre time. So in that case, you've got multiple finance teams that are looking at those costing templates, and without a unified R&D department to actually look at how those are conducted across multiple studies, it becomes very difficult. Site initiation visits, so post-contracting of sites, we like to get in there as soon as possible. Obviously, you've got targets, so do we. Getting in there with the entire team and getting everyone signed off is important. And it really is a two-way process. So this is a slide from the 28th of May that showed nationally we are investing 20 billion into trials in the UK. And it said that there's 50,000 patients that have been involved in clinical trials in the UK. But the question that this slide raised for me is we're continuing to invest, but what is the comparator? So how are other countries actually doing in light of this information? And if you look at, so I continue to advocate for the UK to be included, but you have to think about these countries. So in the same way that, for example, industry has got its act together in the way that it behaves, these countries have traditionally had poor regulatory systems for conducting clinical trials. So the subcontinent, China, Eastern Europe, they've got their act together and they're delivering well on clinical trials. So there's a bit there about the population and how applicable it is, of course, pharmacogenomics, etc. But companies are generally going to look at those countries more than they ever have in the past. So the external challenges that we face, and who knows where it'll go, Brexit. One of the reasons for the UK being so attractive is the NICE and MHRA setups that we have. We're often a reference market for NICE when people are looking at cost effectiveness. The MHRA is one of the main regulators involved in the EMA, and we don't know. And 5 to 10 years from now is where we should be looking. So the graph that Dinesh showed of industry money coming into Bradford, it's not the short-term view that you should be thinking about, it's the 5 to 10-year view and having a plan for now until 2029 as to what that'll actually look like and if we remain one of the best places from a company's perspective to still do research. So I presented this slide at the national meeting. Actually, this is probably a better place to be presenting it because I think I've got in the room decision makers that can make this happen. Why can India sign a digital CDA and we can't in the UK? That's something that to me just strikes of taking too much time to set trials up. So if the person in charge of signing digital CDAs is in the room, please. It's a CDA, it's not a clinical trial agreement. I understand the necessity of a wet signature on a CTA, but if we can get CDA signed digitally, that can sometimes save a couple of weeks by the time it's come to the right person in the right building and ended up coming back. I think you at Bradford are very good of uniform use of the costing template, and actually that's been relatively easy. And the last thing is around the CTA pack. So often R&D departments are reluctant to take the entire HTA pack until it's gone through MHRA approval and ethics approval. There's nothing to stop you from looking at the HRA pack early, which means as soon as you've got ethics approval, you could in theory start a day later, but instead to meet targets, you take it after approvals, and then there's probably a 50-day delay in the setting up of trials. Sometimes we are guilty of not providing all the information, and I did ask at another meeting that if you can standardize what's needed across the NIHR, then we can actually get that pack together early. But I think the other point is that if we've not provided a radiation report early on, but we've given you the protocol, the ethics form and everything else, it would be wonderful if that could start to be reviewed and then we can provide supplemental information along the way. I did have a last slide on something that we're looking at Sanofi, and actually a few other pharma companies are doing it. If you think about the recruitment into clinical trials, the traditional recruitment is they come to your site, you see them in a clinic, there's a poster on the wall that says, remember trial X, why don't you put them into it? And that can take a significant amount of time to build up patients. But if you use the current model, which you're able to use to some degree here, which is looking at multiple channels, so being able to advertise in various ways to patients, but also pre-identify patients before the trial starts, then you can shorten trials. One of the barriers to trials, certainly, is a geographical distribution of patients. And you can imagine somewhere like the US, it's a lot worse than it is in the UK. But if you've only got a couple of sites open, and people want to be involved in a clinical study for where there's a particular unmet need, then actually they could be based in Liverpool, but Bradford be the site that's actually open. So in the US, what we're looking at is a company, Science 37, who are working on delivery of clinical trials remotely. So the patient will have drug that's shipped to their home, study visits might be performed via FaceTime, blood can be drawn locally in local laboratories and sent to a central lab, but also being able to provide care for routine assessments. So It does come with certain issues and logistical issues. We're not quite there yet in the UK, but I foresee that in the future you will have central sites that are selected, but potentially being able to offer this sort of remote access for patients. And with that, I'll finish, and if the time